When people talk about love, they usually picture flowers, laughter, and promises that last forever. But sometimes, love walks into your life wearing a smile and leaves with your trust. My name is Cindy, and this is the story of how my mother, a quiet widowed woman of 58, taught me that being vulnerable doesn't mean being weak. It's the story of the man I thought I was going to marry and the lesson he'll never forget. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Now, let's go back to that house in Ohio, where it all began. My name is Cindy Walker. I'm 28 years old, born and raised in Ohio. I've always been close to my mom, maybe because after my dad passed away, it was just the two of us. She's kind, practical, the type of woman who never loses her calm. I used to think that made her fragile, but this story will show you the exact opposite. 5 years before Marcus stepped into our lives, my world had already been irrevocably altered. My father, James Walker, a detective with the Cleveland Police Department for 32 years, was gone. One day, he was there, filling our three-bedroom suburban Ohio home with his laughter, the comforting scent of stale coffee, and the endless stack of police reports he'd inevitably bring home. The next, he was just a memory, a gaping hole where his substantial, reassuring presence used to be. I was 23 then, fresh out of college, still navigating the awkward transition from student to adult, clutching at the first tenuous threads of independence. Suddenly, the entire safety net of my childhood, the quiet certainty of my father's watchful eye, was ripped away. Grief, I quickly learned, wasn't a wave that broke and receded. It was a relentless tide that slowly, insidiously eroded everything familiar, leaving behind only the jagged edges of absence. Our house, nothing extravagant by any stretch, became our anchor. It wasn't just wood and drywall. It was a tangible testament to my father's quiet perseverance, the only significant asset he'd left behind. A modest, well-maintained home in a quiet Cleveland suburb, free of mortgage, a safe harbor against the storms of life. For my mother, Helen, then 53, it was more than just a home. It was the repository of 3 decades of shared life, a silent archive of their love story, etched into every scuff on the wooden floor and every faded photograph on the mantelpiece. After his funeral, after the initial storm of condolences and casseroles that tasted like sorrow, it was just us two women trying to piece together a new normal within walls that echoed with the profound absence of the man who had built our world within them. The silence was often deafening, filled with unspoken memories. My mother, Helen, had always been the quiet strength in our family. A homemaker by profession, she'd nurtured our home with an almost spiritual devotion, ensuring every corner was filled with warmth and order. But beneath that gentle exterior lay a mind sharper than most people gave her credit for. She'd been my father's sounding board, his confidant, his unofficial crime consultant. I remember him coming home, collapsing into his armchair, loosening his tie, and recounting the day's cases with a weariness that only Helen seemed to understand. He'd delve into the intricacies of human deceit, the endless variations of con artists, the telltale signs of a liar. I, in my youthful self-absorption, would often tune it out, bored by the jargon, by the endless stream of bad guys and their convoluted schemes. But Helen absorbed it all. She'd listen with a quiet intensity, her knitting needles often pausing mid-stitch, her eyes fixed on his face. She'd ask pointed questions, connecting dots, her mind a steel trap that seemed to categorize and store every detail. My father used to joke that she could solve cases faster than half his precinct, often calling her his secret weapon. I never really paid much attention to that, dismissing it as affectionate exaggeration between husband and wife, a sweet domestic ritual. Now I see it for the profound, terrifying truth it was. She wasn't just listening, she was learning. Our life after Dad became a quiet rhythm of resilience. I found an office job, mundane, but stable, a lifeline back to some semblance of routine. Helen, for her part, maintained the house with a meticulousness that was both comforting and, at times, a little heartbreaking, as if keeping everything perfectly ordered could somehow fill the disorder in our lives. We'd sit together in the evenings watching TV, sometimes talking about Dad, sharing a fleeting memory that brought a bittersweet smile, sometimes just existing in companionable silence, our hands clasped across the sofa. We were healing, slowly, or so I thought. We were surviving, building a fragile new life from the wreckage of the old. There was a quiet strength in our unity, though I couldn't articulate it then. Then came Marcus. I met Marcus James Brennan at a friend's birthday party at a lively bar in downtown Cleveland. It was one of those loud, bustling affairs where you barely hear yourself think, the air thick with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. But somehow he cut through the noise, a gravitational pull in the chaos. He was older than me, 36 or 37, with a confident smile that seemed to crinkle the corners of his eyes, just so, and a charm that felt utterly effortless, almost too polished. He worked in construction, a supervisor, he said, overseeing large commercial projects, and he carried himself with an air of understated success, a quiet authority. He was always impeccably dressed, even in casual settings, his clothes perfectly tailored, his cologne subtle but memorable. He drove a spotless black Dodge Ram, an impressive vehicle that gleamed in the Ohio sun, hinting at a life of achievement and stability. He had this way of making me feel like I was the only person in the crowded room, his gaze unwavering, his questions genuine, deeply interested. He asked about my job, my dreams, my family, always listening intently, nodding, offering insightful comments. I was 28, and after 5 years of grieving and feeling adrift, Marcus felt like a stable, solid presence, a port in the storm. He made me laugh with witty anecdotes. He listened with an empathy that felt profound. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope for a future that wasn't just about surviving, but about thriving. He was everything I imagined a partner should be. He was, in my eyes, perfect. The first few months were a whirlwind of perfection. He sent flowers every week, not just on special occasions, but because it was Tuesday, or because he was thinking of me, or because a particularly pretty bouquet caught his eye. They weren't just roses. Sometimes it was lilies, sometimes daisies, always chosen with a thoughtful precision that made my heart flutter. We had dinners at quaint little restaurants downtown, long drives through the scenic routes of Ohio where we talked for hours, sharing our deepest thoughts and dreams, and good morning texts that made me smile before my feet even hit the floor. He was attentive, thoughtful, always remembering the smallest details about our conversations, recalling a favorite author or a childhood memory I'd shared weeks ago. He'd bring Helen flowers too, or a small box of gourmet chocolates, always making sure to acknowledge her, to include her in our burgeoning relationship, asking about her day, listening patiently to her quiet responses. It seemed he was making an effort to become a part of our lives, to bridge the gap that my father's absence had left. He was everything I imagined a partner should be. He was, to me, absolutely perfect. But then there was that one thing, that recurring phrase, dropped into conversations with an almost casual ease, yet resonating with a strange, unsettling echo. You too, alone in that house, so vulnerable. I worry about you. The first time he said it, we were watching the evening news. There'd been a report about a home invasion in a neighboring suburb, and the anchor was interviewing a distraught elderly woman whose house had been ransacked. Marcus leaned closer, his arms settling comfortably around my shoulder, his voice a low, comforting murmur next to my ear. See, that's what I mean, Cindy. You too, alone in that house, so vulnerable. It makes me worry. His voice was low, filled with what sounded like genuine concern, a deep, protective instinct. I remember a warmth spreading through me, a sense of being shielded, cared for. It felt good, reassuring. I saw it as care, as love, even. A man who wanted to protect us, shield us from the harsh realities of the world, from the very dangers we saw flickering across the screen. He was a knight in shining armor, a modern-day protector. My mother, seated across the living room, her knitting needles clicking softly, barely missing a beat, merely looked up. Her eyes, usually warm and expressive, held a quiet intensity one didn't quite register then. It wasn't alarm, not exactly, but something deeper, more analytical. She gave a polite, almost imperceptible smile, a slight tilt of her head before returning to her yarn, her fingers resuming their practiced dance. But there was something in that gaze, something in the way her eyes lingered on Marcus for a beat too long, that hinted at a deeper analysis, a silent processing of information. A flicker, almost imperceptible, of distrust. The comments continued. After a particularly bad thunderstorm that rattled the windows, causing a brief power outage, he called to check on us, his voice laced with concern, a palpable worry in his tone. "Are you two okay? Being alone in that big house with the power out, you're so vulnerable. I wish I could be there to make sure you're safe." Another time, during dinner at our place, discussing our plans for a weekend trip to visit my aunt, he frowned thoughtfully. "Are you sure you want to leave the house empty for so long? You're so vulnerable, with no one keeping an eye on things." It became his signature, a subtle refrain that echoed through our conversations, always gentle, always couched in what appeared to be genuine worry for our well-being. He wasn't overtly pushing, not suggesting anything specific, just planting the seed of our supposed fragility. And always my mother would react in that same understated way. A barely perceptible tightening of her lips, a slow, deliberate blink, a momentary pause in her movements, the subtle tightening of her grip on her teacup. Sometimes I would catch her studying him, her expression unreadable, a quiet curiosity in her gaze, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle only she could see, piecing together fragments of a larger picture. I brushed it off. I rationalized it, convincing myself that she was just being cautious, a mother's natural instinct to protect her daughter, especially after losing her husband. She was a widow, I thought, perhaps feeling her own vulnerability more keenly, seeing shadows where there were none. Or perhaps she simply wasn't used to this kind of overt affection, this explicit expression of concern from a man after so many years of quiet domesticity. I was blinded by what I thought was love, by the promise of security and companionship that Marcus seemed to embody. I craved it after years of grief and the gnawing emptiness my father left behind. And Marcus offered it in abundance, a balm to my aching heart. But every tightening of my mother's lips, every quiet hum of contemplation that escaped her, they were tiny discordant notes in the symphony of what I believed was a perfect love story. They were seeds of doubt, planted not by words, but by the silent, watchful gaze of a woman who had for 3 decades been privy to the darkest corners of the human psyche, learning far more from my detective father than any of us, especially Marcus, could ever imagine. And those seeds, in time, would blossom into a chilling truth, revealing a landscape far more treacherous than I could ever have conceived. I just didn't know it yet. The air in our home, usually quiet and filled with the ghosts of laughter past, had taken on a new, vibrant energy. It had been almost exactly a year since Marcus walked into my life, a year that felt like a lifetime. We were at our favorite Italian restaurant, the soft glow of candlelight reflecting in his eyes as he held my hand across the table. We just finished dessert when he looked at me, a smile playing on his lips, and reached into his jacket pocket. My breath hitched. He got down on one knee, right there in the middle of the bustling restaurant, a velvet box in his outstretched hand. "Cindy," he began, his voice surprisingly steady, "you've brought so much light back into my life. I love you completely. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in my eyes. I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I choked out as he slipped the sparkling diamond onto my finger. He pulled me into a tight embrace, and for a moment, the world felt utterly, undeniably perfect. I was 30 now, and finally, after the heartbreak of losing my father, I was going to have my own happy ending. We spent the next few weeks in a blissful haze, the engagement ring a constant reminder of the future Marcus, and I were building. We talked endlessly about wedding plans, a small ceremony, a reception in our backyard, and about our dreams. My mother, Helen, offered her quiet congratulations, a gentle smile on her face. I caught her watching Marcus sometimes, her expression unreadable, but I dismissed it as a mother's natural protective instincts. It was during one of these planning sessions, about a month after the proposal, that Marcus first introduced his business proposition. We were sitting in our living room, bridal magazines scattered on the coffee table. Helen was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, the gentle clatter of pots and pans a comforting background noise. Cindy, Helen, he began, a serious, earnest tone replacing his usual buoyant energy. There's something important I need to talk to you both about. It's about my future, our future. He explained his dream of opening his own construction materials distributorship, detailing a meticulous business plan, projecting incredible profits. He spoke of booming markets, scarcity of suppliers, and exponential growth. The only hurdle, he continued, his gaze intense, is the initial capital. I need a significant loan from the bank, around $150,000, to secure a warehouse, inventory, and launch operations. The bank is impressed, but they need solid collateral. Something substantial, something tangible, to back the loan. A knot formed in my stomach. I had an uneasy feeling about where this was going. Helen emerged from the kitchen, carrying iced tea, her eyes, as always, observant. She settled into my father's old armchair, her hands clasped calmly in her lap, her gaze now fixed on Marcus. Marcus took a deep breath, his confident smile returning, a fraction too wide. He looked at Helen directly. "Helen," he said, his voice smooth and persuasive, "Cindy, you too have this house. It's perfect. It's beautiful. It's paid off. No mortgage, right?" My heart sank. This house. Our house. The one thing my father had left us. If we could, Marcus pressed on, sensing my unease, if we could temporarily put the deed to this house in my name, just for the purpose of securing that bank loan, it would make all the difference. It's only temporary, of course. Once the business is off the ground, once I've repaid the loan, we'll transfer it right back. And by then, we'll be married, and everything will be truly family property anyway. It's just a formality, a way to show the bank I'm serious, that I have solid assets. It's a win-win. I sat there, stunned. How could he ask that? To transfer our home, even temporarily, felt like a betrayal. I opened my mouth to protest, but my mother spoke first. Her voice was calm, almost unnervingly so, a stark contrast to the tumult in my heart. "I see," Helen said, her gaze steady, unblinking, fixed on Marcus. Her face was a mask of placid consideration. "Transfer the deed, temporarily, you say, to secure your business loan." She took a slow sip of her iced tea. "I'll need to think about it, Marcus." My jaw almost dropped. "Think about it?" That's all she said, not a furious refusal, just a promise to consider it. I looked at Marcus. He seemed surprised too, though he quickly recovered, flashing a charming, hopeful smile. "Of course, Helen. Take all the time you need." The next 2 days were agony for me. The silence in the house, usually comforting, now felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken questions. I tried to talk to my mother. "Mom, are you serious about this? About giving Marcus the house? Dad worked his whole life for this place." Helen merely paused, stacking plates, her tone even, her expression calm. "It's a big decision, Cindy. I told him I'd think." She gave nothing away, leaving me to stew in a mix of dread and a faint, desperate hope. On the morning of the third day, Helen's calm voice cut through my anxiety. "I've made my decision, Cindy. Call Marcus. Tell him I'd like him to come over this evening." My heart jumped. This was it. When Marcus arrived that evening, he carried himself with an air of barely contained anticipation. Helen, by contrast, was the picture of serene composure. She seated herself in my father's favorite armchair, took a slow sip of coffee, and settled her gaze on Marcus. "Marcus," she began, her voice soft, almost maternal, "I've given your proposal a great deal of thought these past 2 days." I held my breath, bracing myself for the refusal. Then she continued, and my world tilted. "I will pass the house over to your name, Marcus." I gasped, a small, involuntary sound. My head snapped towards my mother, my eyes wide with disbelief, with a profound sense of betrayal. Marcus almost leaped from his chair, his face alight with triumph, a wide, almost predatory grin splitting his features. "Oh, Helen! Thank you. Thank you so much. You won't regret this, I promise." Helen raised a hand, a subtle gesture that immediately quieted him. Her smile was faint, almost imperceptible, a Mona Lisa enigma. But, she continued, her voice still smooth as velvet, her gaze fixed on Marcus, there are, of course, some costs involved. The deed transfer, all the necessary documentation, registry fees, the lawyer's fees for drafting the temporary agreement. These things add up. I've made some inquiries. It will cost around $15,000. I don't have that kind of money readily available, Marcus. So, how are we going to manage that? Marcus's triumphant expression faltered for a microsecond, a flash of annoyance, quickly masked, but then, almost instantly, his smile returned, broader, more determined. The price, it seemed, was well worth it to him. Oh, the amount. Yes, that's quite a bit, isn't it? He said, trying to sound thoughtful, but his eyes betrayed his eagerness. But don't you worry, Helen. This will help me immensely, truly. I'll figure it out. I'll make it work. He stood, pacing with renewed vigor. I'll get the money. Don't worry about a thing. And he did. In an astonishingly quick 3 days, Marcus reappeared at our doorstep, a thick envelope clutched in his hand. He looked exhilarated, radiating a palpable sense of victory. Here you go, Helen, he announced, practically thrusting the envelope towards her. $15,000. In cash. Just as you asked. My mother took the envelope with the same calm grace, her expression unperturbed. She opened it, counting the neatly stacked bills with an almost casual air. Her eyes, however, were keen, missing nothing. Excellent, she said, finally looking up, her gaze meeting his with a quiet intensity. Now, for the paperwork. For the lawyer to draft everything correctly, I'll need some of your personal documents. Your driver's license, your social security number, proof of income, just the standard things, to ensure everything is legitimate and above board. You understand. Her voice was still soft, polite, almost deferential. Marcus, basking in the warm glow of his perceived victory, nodded enthusiastically. Of course, Helen. Anything you need. He pulled out his wallet without a moment's hesitation, handing over his driver's license, his social security card, and even a pay stub from his previous job. He seemed to genuinely believe he was in control, that he was navigating a simple transaction. He seemed utterly blind to the meticulous precision with which my mother collected each document, her fingers steady, her eyes scanning each detail with an unnerving thoroughness. He saw a trusting widow, a naive older woman. I, however, saw my mother methodically collecting pieces for a puzzle I couldn't yet comprehend, a silent, almost predatory calm radiating from her. It was a calmness that, in retrospect, should have terrified me. It was the calm of a hunter setting a trap I was too blind and too heartbroken to see. The 2 weeks that followed Marcus's delivery of the $15,000 were a strange, disquieting limbo for me. My mother, Helen, had taken his personal documents, his driver's license, social security card, and pay stub, along with the thick envelope of cash, and had simply vanished. Not literally, of course. She was still in the house, going about her routines, cooking meals, tending to her garden. But whenever I asked about the house deed, about the lawyer, about her friend at the registry office, she would offer only vague assurances. Everything is being handled. Cindy, these things take time, you know, bureaucracy. Her answers were always delivered with that same unnerving calm, her eyes serene, her demeanor utterly unperturbed. It was as if she had detached herself from the entire situation, treating it with a detached patience that grated on my nerves. My anxiety, already a constant companion, ratcheted up several notches. I watched her, trying to read her, searching for any flicker of doubt, any sign that she understood the monumental risk we were taking. But there was nothing. Her composure was absolute. Marcus, on the other hand, called almost daily. His initial calls were full of eager questions. Any news from your mom? Has the deed gone through? When can I expect the paperwork? Each time, I'd relay Helen's noncommittal responses, watching his enthusiasm dim slightly, replaced by a growing impatience. He tried to hide it, but I could hear it in the clipped edges of his words, the hurried cadence of his voice. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and this delay, however brief, was clearly chafing him. I felt caught in the middle, a bewildered pawn in a game I didn't understand, desperately wanting to trust Marcus, but increasingly unsettled by my mother's silent, inexplicable machinations. Then, exactly 2 weeks after Marcus had handed over the cash and his documents, Helen returned from an afternoon out. She walked through the front door with the same unhurried grace she always did, a large, worn leather briefcase clutched in her hand. My heart leaped into my throat. "Mom, is that—" She nodded, a faint, almost secret smile playing on her lips. "Yes, dear. It's all done. My friend at the registry office was a great help. Everything is prepared." She placed the briefcase gently on the dining room table, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. My eyes were glued to it, a repository of our fate. "Call Marcus, Cindy. Tell him to come over. It's time to finalize everything." My hands trembled as I dialed his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp with anticipation. "Cindy, is it done?" I told him Helen had returned with the papers. "I'll be right over," he said, and the line went dead. There was no "I love you," no "I miss you," just a raw, undisguised eagerness. A new sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through my carefully constructed facade of happiness. He arrived less than 15 minutes later, practically bursting through the door, his usual polished charm replaced by an almost frantic excitement. His eyes, usually warm, now gleamed with an avaricious light I hadn't seen before. He barely acknowledged me, his gaze fixed solely on Helen and the briefcase on the table. Helen was already seated, her usual spot in Dad's armchair, the briefcase open before her, a thick stack of papers inside. She looked utterly composed, her hands clasped in her lap, watching Marcus with that same unreadable stillness. I sat on the sofa, feeling like an unwanted observer at my own execution. "Helen, is it ready?" Marcus exclaimed, striding towards the table, a broad, triumphant smile stretching across his face. He leaned over the table, peering at the documents with an eagerness that bordered on manic. "Yes, Marcus," Helen replied, her voice soft, calm, almost soothing. She pulled out a few pages from the stack. They looked like official documents, densely typed with spaces for signatures. "My friend at the registry office, she's very efficient. She prepared everything perfectly. Just needs your signature here, here, and here." She pointed to 3 distinct spots on the papers with the tip of a pen. Marcus didn't hesitate. Not for a second. He barely glanced at the pages, his eyes skipping over the dense legal jargon, his focus entirely on the signature lines. His confidence, his absolute conviction of victory, was almost blinding. He was so consumed by the idea of owning our house, of having the deed in his name, that the actual content of the papers seemed utterly irrelevant to him. He practically snatched the pen from Helen's hand and scrawled his signature with a flourish, a wide, self-satisfied grin plastered on his face. He signed quickly, decisively, completely convinced of his shrewdness, of his undeniable win. Each stroke of the pen felt like a physical blow to my chest, a final severing of my father's connection to our home. I watched, helpless, my breath catching in my throat, a silent scream building inside me. As he finished the last signature, Marcus looked up, a triumphant glint in his eyes. He leaned back, a smug, almost arrogant expression settling on his features, as if he had just outsmarted the world. He pushed the papers back towards Helen, a gesture of ownership, of completion. "There," he announced, his voice oozing satisfaction. "All done. The house is mine." Helen didn't return his smile. She simply folded the papers with the same meticulous care she used for laundry and placed them back into the briefcase. She snapped the clasp shut with a soft click that echoed ominously in the sudden silence. Then she looked at Marcus, her gaze steady, unblinking, that faint, enigmatic smile still playing on her lips. Her voice, when she spoke, was almost dangerously casual, as if she were inquiring about the weather. "And the loan, Marcus?" she asked, her tone light conversational. "When do you plan on going to the bank now that everything is finalized?" The transformation was instantaneous, dramatic. It was like watching a switch being flipped, a mask being ripped away. The smug triumph on Marcus's face vanished, replaced by a sudden, chilling blankness, then by a cold, hard anger. His eyes, moments ago gleaming with avarice, now narrowed into slits of pure ice. The charming smile, the one that had captivated me for a year, completely disappeared, replaced by a tight, hostile line. His posture, usually so confident and open, stiffened, becoming defensive, almost aggressive. "I don't know yet," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth. The smooth, persuasive tone I had come to know was gone, replaced by a chilling detachment. "What do you mean? You don't know?" I blurted out, unable to contain my confusion, my rising panic. Marcus cut me off, his voice suddenly sharp, laced with an unfamiliar venom that made me flinch. He didn't even look at me. His gaze was fixed on Helen, cold and resentful. "I said I don't know, Helen." He stood up abruptly, knocking his coffee cup with a clatter that made me jump. He snatched his copy of the signed documents from the table, the very ones he hadn't read, and without another word, without a glance back at me, he stormed out of the house, slamming the front door behind him with a force that rattled the very foundations of our home. The silence that followed was deafening, suffocating. I stared at the closed door, my heart pounding, a cold knot forming in my stomach. What just happened? One moment, he was the loving fiancé, the ambitious businessman, and the next he was a stranger, radiating hostility. I looked at my mother, desperate for an explanation, for comfort, but she simply sat there, calmly, her expression unreadable, her hands still clasped, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. The briefcase remained closed on the table, the $15,000 cash, Marcus's documents, and the signed papers were now all in her possession. I tried to call him immediately. My fingers flew across the keypad, my mind racing, trying to rationalize his behavior. Maybe he was stressed. Maybe he had a bad day. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, then went to voicemail. I tried again and again. I must have called him 20 times that night, leaving increasingly frantic messages, begging him to call me back, to explain. Nothing. No response, not even a text. My anxiety spiraled into a full-blown panic. The diamond ring on my finger, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a heavy, meaningless weight. The next day, still reeling from his abrupt exit, I decided to go to his construction site. I needed to see him, to understand. I drove to the sprawling complex on the outskirts of Cleveland, my heart hammering in my chest. When I arrived, the site manager, a gruff man named Frank who usually greeted me with a friendly nod, looked at me with a bewildered expression. "Cindy, what are you doing here? Marcus isn't here." He paused, scratching his head. "He hasn't been here for a few days. Said he was leaving, moving on to another opportunity." He sounded genuinely confused, as if Marcus had simply vanished into thin air. He just quit. No notice, no explanation. Just cleared out his desk. My world crumbled. He had quit his job. He had disappeared. The man I was engaged to marry, the man who was supposed to be building a future with me, was gone. The betrayal, the profound sense of abandonment, hit me like a physical blow. I drove home in a daze, tears streaming down my face, the landscape of Ohio a blurry, indistinguishable mess. I kept picturing his triumphant grin as he signed the papers, his cold eyes as he stormed out. It was all a lie. All of it. That entire week passed in a haze of grief and confusion. I barely ate, barely slept, convinced that my life was over, that I had been utterly, completely duped. My mother watched me with a quiet intensity, occasionally offering a cup of tea or a simple meal, but she never lectured, never consoled in the way I desperately craved. She merely observed, her silence a strange comfort, yet also a source of growing frustration. She knew something, I was certain, but she wasn't sharing it. The $15,000, Marcus's documents, the mysterious signed papers, they were all carefully tucked away, out of sight, never mentioned. Then, exactly 1 week after Marcus had stormed out, a violent pounding erupted at our front door. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a furious, aggressive battering that vibrated through the entire house. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. Helen, already in the living room, simply rose from her armchair, her movements slow, deliberate, utterly devoid of fear. She walked to the door, her back ramrod straight, and opened it. Standing on our porch, his face pale with rage, his eyes cold and hard as steel, was Marcus. His usual impeccably tailored clothes were rumpled, his hair disheveled. He looked less like the charming man I had fallen in love with, and more like a cornered animal, brimming with hostility. His posture was aggressive, leaning forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You too," he spat, his voice low and menacing, barely recognizable. "You have 5 days. 5 days to get out of my house." He thrust a crumpled piece of paper at Helen. It looked like a printed notice, official-looking, but I couldn't make out the details from where I stood. "I have an attorney. I have the deed. This house is mine now. Get out." My blood ran cold. He had the deed. How? My mother had collected the papers. This couldn't be happening. My mind raced, trying to put the pieces together. But all I could feel was overwhelming terror. We were going to be homeless. But Helen didn't flinch. She merely took the paper from his hand, her gaze steady, her composure unshakable. She looked him squarely in the eye, her voice clear, calm, and utterly devoid of fear. "I want to see who's going to make me leave this house, Marcus," she said, her tone a quiet challenge that sent shivers down my spine. "Because I don't believe for a second that this house is yours." Her words, soft as they were, seemed to echo with the authority of a judge delivering a verdict. And in that moment, seeing my mother stand so firm, so fearless against his aggression, a tiny, defiant spark ignited within me. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. The next 3 days after Marcus's aggressive ultimatum were a tense, silent standoff. We didn't hear from him, but his threat hung heavy in the air, a poisonous cloud. I imagined him hiring lawyers, plotting our eviction, fantasizing about throwing us out onto the street. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a battleground. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the afternoon sun, seemed to hold a sinister edge. I barely slept, my mind a churning vortex of fear and confusion, trying to reconcile the charming man I had loved with the hostile stranger who had stormed our porch. My mother, Helen, however, remained a picture of unsettling calm. She went about her daily routines with an almost serene detachment, watering her plants, reading her books, occasionally offering me a cup of tea with a quiet, knowing look in her eyes that offered no explanation, only a strange sense of anticipation. It was a patience that drove me mad, yet also inexplicably gave me a sliver of hope. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, as the first rays of sunlight were just beginning to filter through the kitchen window, it happened. A frantic, almost deranged pounding erupted at our front door. It wasn't the aggressive, calculated banging of a few days prior. This was desperate, hysterical, as if someone was trying to beat the door down with their bare fists. The entire house vibrated with the force of it. My heart leaped into my throat, adrenaline coursing through my veins. "He's back," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Helen, already at the kitchen table sipping her morning coffee, simply rose. Her movements were slow, deliberate, utterly devoid of any haste or fear. She walked towards the door, her back straight, her expression a mask of complete composure. I watched her, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and a strange, morbid curiosity. She reached the door, paused for a moment, and then, with a serene grace, she opened it. Standing on our porch, a stark contrast to his impeccably dressed demeanor of just a week prior, was Marcus. He was utterly transformed. His face was ghastly pale, almost translucent, stretched taut with a fury that distorted his features beyond recognition. His eyes, usually charming and confident, now blazed with a wild, desperate rage, bloodshot and frantic. His neatly combed hair was disheveled, falling across his forehead, and his clothes, though expensive, looked rumpled and slept in. He was trembling, his entire body vibrating with an uncontrolled, visceral anger. He looked like a man on the brink of collapse, pushed past his breaking point. "You!" he shrieked, his voice raw, hoarse, barely human. He pointed a shaking finger at Helen, his chest heaving. "You gave me fake documents. My lawyer said, these are worthless. You tricked me." His words were punctuated by a desperate, almost manic energy, his accusation echoing through the quiet morning air. He was clutching a crumpled stack of papers in his hand, the very ones he had signed so confidently just days ago. My mother didn't flinch. Not a muscle in her face moved. She simply looked at him, her gaze calm, steady, and utterly unwavering. Her voice, when she spoke, was a soft, almost pitying whisper. "Fake documents? Marcus, I didn't give you any documents. What are you talking about?" Her tone was so genuinely bewildered, so convincingly innocent that for a split second, even I almost believed her. Marcus roared, his face contorting further. "The $15,000. I want my money back. You stole my money." He took a step forward, his fists clenching, his body threatening to spill over the threshold. But Helen held her ground, a silent, unmoving barrier. Helen blinked slowly, her expression shifting from bewildered innocence to mild concern, as if she were talking to a deluded child. $15,000? What, $15,000, Marcus? You never gave me any money. Have you gone mad? Her voice was so quiet, so perfectly modulated, that it carried an undeniable ring of truth, a dismissive incredulity that seemed to deflate some of Marcus's rage, if only for a second. It was in that moment, watching Marcus's raw, sputtering disbelief, that a horrifying yet exhilarating realization dawned on me. My mother, she had planned all of this. Every single step. The casual mention of my friend at the registry office, the fabricated $15,000 fees, the stack of papers Marcus had so carelessly signed. It was all a meticulously crafted deception. Helen hadn't actually gone to any registry office. She hadn't hired a lawyer. She had simply taken Marcus's original personal documents, his money, and had then produced grossly rough copies of our actual deed, papers so obviously fake, so amateurishly constructed, that any actual lawyer or bank official would have laughed in his face. She had invented a friend at the registry office to lend an air of legitimacy to her actions, a believable cover for her elaborate charade. She had armed herself with a few blank forms, perhaps downloaded from the internet, and had filled them in with just enough official-looking jargon and signatures to fool a man who was too blinded by his own greed and arrogance to scrutinize them properly. It was a deception so brazenly obvious, yet so cunningly executed, that only a confident, almost pathologically overconfident swindler like Marcus would fall for it without question. He had been so utterly convinced of his victory, so sure that he was fleecing two vulnerable women, that he had signed away his own vulnerability. The $15,000 wasn't for fees. It was a payment. Our payment. She had not only foiled his plan, but she had also managed to extract a hefty sum from his ill-gotten gains. My mother had just effectively taken money from a con artist, using his own methods against him. The sheer audacity of it left me breathless. It wasn't just about protecting our home. It was about ensuring that we profited from his dishonesty, turning his predatory intentions back on himself. She had gambled on his arrogance, and he had paid the price. Marcus stared at Helen, his mouth opening and closing, words failing him. The shock of her denial, so absolute and convincing, seemed to momentarily short-circuit his rage. He looked from her perfectly serene face to the crumpled papers in his hand, then back again, as if trying to piece together a reality that was rapidly slipping away from him. You lying bitch," he finally spat, his voice trembling with frustrated fury. "I have the papers. I gave you the money. I'm going to the police. I'm going to press charges." Helen merely nodded slowly, a knowing glint now in her eyes. "You do that, Marcus," she said, her voice still infuriatingly calm. "You absolutely do that." And he did. Marcus, desperate and cornered, actually went to the police. I learned this later, piecing together the events from my mother's quiet observations. He walked into the Cleveland Police Department, a man whose entire world had just collapsed, demanding justice. He presented his deed, those crude, obviously fake copies my mother had concocted, claiming he had been defrauded. He told them he had paid $15,000 cash for the transfer of the house, only to discover the documents were worthless. The police, however, were not the naive victims Marcus was accustomed to. They asked him for proof of payment. Did he have a receipt, for the $15,000 cash. A bank transfer? A witness? Of course, he didn't. He had handed over cash, believing he was dealing with two unsophisticated women who wouldn't demand such formalities. Then, they asked him about the deed he possessed. Where did he get it? Who was the lawyer? Who was the friend at the registry office that had supposedly prepared these documents? Marcus, floundering, could only offer vague, contradictory answers, stumbling over his own lies. He couldn't explain how he came to possess a document that looked like a bad photocopy of a legitimate deed, complete with what must have been obviously fake signatures and notary stamps. He couldn't prove he had given my mother any money, and he certainly couldn't explain why he had signed a document without reading it. The police undoubtedly saw a man trying to pull a fast one, a con artist caught in his own web. He had walked in to complain about being conned, and instead had revealed his own criminal intent. He had quite literally handed them the evidence of his attempted fraud. Marcus left the police station not only empty-handed but thoroughly scrutinized, his attempts at playing the victim unraveling before his very eyes. He couldn't prove my mother had conned him because the evidence he brought implicated him. He knew, with a dawning, terrifying certainty, that he had been played. And he also knew, deep down, that his elaborate scam, designed to steal our home, had backfired spectacularly, costing him a significant sum of money and leaving him with nothing but useless paper. The story, I thought then, could have ended there. We had our house. We had his $15,000. Marcus was out of our lives. But my mother, Helen Walker, a widow who had spent 32 years absorbing the intricacies of criminal psychology from her detective husband, wasn't just interested in defending our home. She was interested in justice, in ensuring that Marcus Brennan would never prey on anyone else again. She wasn't just protecting us. She was eradicating a threat, and she had just begun. The very next day, a crisp autumn morning, my mother dressed meticulously as if preparing for a formal event. "Come on, Cindy," she said, her voice calm, her eyes gleaming with a quiet, steely resolve. "We're going to the police station." My heart pounded. The police? Was she going to report Marcus for his threats? For trying to steal our home? I followed her, still in a daze, still reeling from the events of the past few days. We walked into the Cleveland Police Department, the same building my father had worked in for decades, a place that held so many memories. My mother carried the original deed to our house, carefully tucked into her briefcase. We spoke to an officer, a young man who looked slightly overwhelmed by the day's events. Helen, with her usual composure, explained the situation. She told him that Marcus James Brennan, her daughter's ex-fiancé, had attempted to defraud them. She described how he had tried to trick them into transferring the deed to their home, only to disappear after she, in her naive trust, had supposedly given him money for the transfer. Then, with a gentle, almost regretful sigh, she dropped the bombshell. "And he took our original deed. Officer. He must have somehow swapped it when he was here trying to get me to sign papers. He came back yesterday, demanding we leave, showing me some papers he claimed were the new deed. I think he took our original, genuine deed and falsified it to make it look like he owned our home, intending to evict us." I nearly gasped. Helen was turning his own accusation back on him. We didn't have Marcus's crudely forged deed, the one he had signed. He had taken it, but the police knew about it. After all, Marcus himself had come to the station just yesterday, waving those very papers around, making a scene. He had, in his fury, essentially provided the police with the evidence of his own attempted fraud against us. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. The officer, remembering Marcus's frantic visit from the day before, listened intently. He looked at Helen's calm, trustworthy face, at my distraught one, and nodded. He took down our statement, meticulously documenting everything my mother said. He understood. Marcus Brennan had walked into the police station claiming to be a victim, waving a clearly forged document, and instead had implicated himself as a con artist. Now, we were simply corroborating his own unwitting confession. Marcus James Brennan was arrested that afternoon. The charges: forgery, attempted fraud, and grand larceny, given the $15,000 he had taken from us under false pretenses, a sum that, in the police's eyes, was now viewed as money stolen by him, not given. The investigation was swift. His disappearance from his job, his frantic behavior, his inability to explain the origin of the fake deed, and his failed attempt to prove the $15,000 payment, all painted a clear picture. He had preyed on my mother's perceived vulnerability, and she, with a cold, calculated brilliance, had turned his own weapon against him. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced. Justice, delivered in a way I never could have foreseen, had been served. But my mother wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. The day after Marcus Brennan's conviction was cold and gray, a typical Ohio autumn morning that perfectly mirrored the chill in my bones. The trial had been swift, devastatingly so for Marcus. The evidence, meticulously gathered by the police and bolstered by my mother's calm, coherent testimony, was damning. His own frantic complaint, the fake deed he'd presented, his inability to account for the $15,000 cash, and his sudden disappearance from work, it all painted a clear picture of a man caught red-handed in a sophisticated scam. He had been found guilty of attempted fraud, forgery, and larceny. 5 years in state prison. His life, as he knew it, was over. And a part of me, the part that had genuinely loved him, mourned the man I thought he was. But another part, a harder, more resilient part forged by the recent revelations about his true nature, felt a grim satisfaction. He deserved it. He had tried to steal everything from us, to turn our lives upside down. He had seen us as targets. And for that, there had to be consequences. My mother, Helen, suggested we visit him. I was hesitant, still raw from the emotional whiplash of discovery and betrayal, but her calm resolve was unyielding. "We need to go, Cindy," she said, her voice soft but firm, already dressed in a smart, dark blue suit, as if preparing for a business meeting. "There are some things that need to be said." I didn't argue. By then, I had learned that when Helen had something to say, it was usually important, and always delivered with a purpose. The prison was a grim, imposing structure of gray concrete and barbed wire, stark against the overcast sky. The air inside was heavy, smelling of disinfectant and despair. We were led to a visiting room, a stark, sterile space divided by a thick pane of plexiglass. Telephones, bolted to the counter on either side, were the only means of communication. The dull hum of fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on our faces. Marcus was already seated on the other side, waiting. He looked different, shrunken, his once impeccable clothes replaced by a pale orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. His eyes, usually so vibrant and expressive, were now dull, defeated, haunted. He had circles under them, and his jaw was slack. When he saw us, a flicker of something, surprise, anger, resignation, crossed his face. He picked up the receiver on his side, his movements sluggish. I picked up mine, my hand trembling slightly. "Helen," he rasped, his voice rough, amused. He didn't even acknowledge me. His gaze was fixed solely on my mother, a mixture of hatred and bewildered confusion etched on his features. "Why are you here?" My mother met his gaze, completely unperturbed. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, controlled, almost gentle, a stark contrast to the harsh surroundings and Marcus's raw emotion. "We're here to talk, Marcus, to help you understand." She leaned slightly closer to the plexiglass, her presence radiating a quiet authority that seemed to shrink him further. "You thought you had us, didn't you? Because I was a widow, because I was 58 years old, because my daughter was foolishly in love, you thought we were easy prey, that we had no protection, that you could simply walk into our lives, earn our trust, and take everything." Marcus scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. His face contorted, a flash of his old aggression resurfacing. "You stole from me," he hissed, slamming his fist on the small metal table between them, the sound muffled by the glass. A guard at the far end of the room looked up, his eyes narrowing, but Marcus ignored him. "I gave you $15,000. You tricked me. You're the criminals." My mother smiled then, a small, knowing curve of her lips that held no warmth, only a chilling satisfaction. "No, Marcus," she said, her voice still soft, almost conversational. "You tried to steal from us. The difference is you failed. And we succeeded. You signed those papers so quickly, so eagerly. You didn't even look properly, did you? Because in your head, you had already won. You were already counting the money, already picturing us out on the street, with nothing. Marcus pounded the table again, a low growl escaping his throat. The guard took a step towards our cubicle, a warning in his stance. Marcus took a ragged breath, visibly trying to control himself, his chest heaving. His eyes, however, still burned with impotent rage. You know what I don't understand, Marcus? Helen continued, her voice weaving through the phone like velvet, a calm, relentless dissection. You researched the house. You researched the neighborhood. You found out how much it was worth, that it was paid off. But you didn't research me. Marcus stared, a flicker of something new in his eyes now, confusion perhaps, or a dawning, terrible understanding. What is that supposed to mean? He muttered, his bravado cracking. My husband, James Walker, Helen began, her voice taking on a different timbre, a quiet pride in her tone, was a detective for 32 years. He didn't just work with criminals, Marcus. He taught me about them. Every dinner, every night, for 3 decades, he would come home and tell me about the cases, about the cons, about the profiles of the people who commit them, about how to identify a liar, how to spot a pattern, how to read between the lines of human deception. She leaned closer to the glass again, her gaze unwavering, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet clear as a bell through the receiver. He had a favorite case. He loved to tell me about it. It was about a con artist who operated for years, sometimes months, sometimes even years, building relationships with older women. Widows, specifically. Middle-class women, often with a house paid off. A small nest egg. He would charm them, propose marriage, convince them to put their properties in his name temporarily for some fabricated business venture, and then he would simply disappear with everything. Marcus's face, already pale, turned ashen. A shiver seemed to run through him, despite the stuffy warmth of the room. He knew this story. He was this story. This con artist operated for 8 years, Helen continued, her voice relentless, before my husband finally caught him. Do you know how many women he defrauded? 14. 14 lives destroyed. 14 homes lost. And you know what James always said about that case, Marcus? Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Marcus couldn't speak, couldn't even meet her gaze. He simply stared down at the table, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. He always said, Helen, these predators always make the same mistake. They look for vulnerability. They see an older woman, a grieving woman, a lonely woman, and they think weak. But vulnerability and foolishness are 2 different things, and they never learn the difference until it's too late. My mother's words, delivered with such quiet power, hung in the air like a death knell. Marcus was trembling, now visibly, violently, whether from rage or from fear, I couldn't tell. Perhaps both. The realization, slow and agonizing, was finally sinking in. When you used the word vulnerable for the first time, Helen pressed on, her voice soft, almost sympathetic, yet utterly devastating. The second time we met, I believe, I put my guard up. When you proposed the transfer of our house, I was certain. Then I went to work. I checked your background. I spoke to women you had dated before, not directly, of course, but through a few carefully placed inquiries, a little old-fashioned detective work of my own, the kind James taught me to do. I discovered an interesting pattern. She reached into her purse, retrieving a small, discreet folder. From it, she pulled out a few printed pages. They weren't legal documents. They were printouts from social media, old news articles, even a few blurry photographs. 3 long-term girlfriends in 5 years, she stated, her voice crisp, definitive. All of them ended abruptly after 6 to 12 months. All of them widows or recently divorced with assets. All of them living alone. She placed the prints against the glass, letting Marcus see them. Old photos of him with other women, smiling, happy, oblivious to the wolf in sheep's clothing. None of them had any way to prove anything, and they were too ashamed, too heartbroken to do anything about it. But the patterns were there. Always the same tactics, always the same conversation about protecting, about how they were defenseless. You're not as clever as you think you are, Marcus. You're predictable. That doesn't prove anything. Marcus finally rasped, his voice barely a whisper, though he couldn't tear his eyes away from the photos. His face was a mask of despair, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. No, my mother conceded, her voice calm. It didn't prove anything in a court of law, but it gave me certainty. It gave me all the certainty I needed. She gently closed the folder, putting the pictures away, a final definitive gesture. So, I made a choice, Marcus. I could have simply expelled you from our lives, reported you to the police based on my suspicions, and you would have simply found another victim, another mother and daughter, who wouldn't have known how to defend themselves, another home to steal. She looked directly into his eyes, a profound, unwavering gaze that seemed to pierce through his very soul. Or I could give you exactly what you wanted. Let you think you had won. Let your own greed blind you. And then I could use your own arrogance against you. The $15,000, Marcus, she concluded, her voice low and resonant, was your price. The cost of taking you out of circulation. The cost of ensuring you would never do this to anyone else again. It was a worthwhile investment. I watched Marcus unravel in real time. The man who had once exuded such charm and confidence now looked utterly broken, defeated. 5 years in prison. A criminal record that would follow him for life. His future, his carefully crafted persona, shattered beyond repair. And the only person he could truly blame was his own insatiable greed, his towering arrogance. He had believed his own lies, believed in his superiority over two supposedly helpless women. You're psychopaths, he whispered, his voice thin, reedy, barely audible through the receiver. No, my mother said, her voice sharp, cutting through his accusation with surgical precision. She stood up, a quiet dignity in her posture. We are exactly what you called us, Marcus. Defenseless, vulnerable, 2 women alone in a big house. We even left the light on for you. She picked up the folder of photos and turned to leave. At the door to the visiting room, she paused, looking over her shoulder one last time. The difference, Marcus, she said, her eyes gleaming with a profound, almost terrifying intelligence, is that you mistook defenseless for weak. And that was your biggest mistake. With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Marcus alone in his cell, his shattered reality his only company. We never saw Marcus Brennan again after that day. He faded into the anonymous gray of the prison system, just another con artist caught in his own web. My mother, Helen, continued her quiet life, still tending her garden, still reading her books. The $15,000 Marcus had given us was tucked away, not in a savings account, but in a separate, secure investment. Emergency fund, she'd said, with a tiny, satisfied smile when I asked her about it much later. Years later, sitting on the porch swing as the sun set over our familiar Cleveland home, I asked her how she had ever come up with such an elaborate, ingenious plan. She took a slow sip of her iced tea, her gaze thoughtful as she looked out over the quiet street, a peaceful smile on her face. Your father always said, Cindy, she mused, her voice soft, imbued with the wisdom of a lifetime, the best way to catch a predator is to let him think you're the prey. Marcus had spent an entire year calling us defenseless, vulnerable, fragile. He had staked his entire future on that assumption, and he had lost everything, because the truth is, you should never, ever underestimate a detective's widow with a sharp mind, a deep understanding of human nature, and a little bit of time. Defenseless? He had no idea. The chill of that prison room, the stark plexiglass separating what was from what could have been, still lingers in my memory. Marcus, reduced to a hollow shell, finally grasped the intricate web my mother had so patiently woven around him. He came for our home, convinced of our vulnerability, believing he saw weakness where there was only quiet strength. Instead, he left with nothing but a life sentence of regret. The $15,000 he paid a bitter testament to his hubris, a permanent marker of his profound misjudgment. He saw a meal, she saw an opportunity for justice, for a final, definitive closure. It's a powerful lesson in perception, isn't it? How often do we project our own assumptions onto others, mistaking stillness for weakness, quietness for naivety? My mother, with her unyielding calm and piercing intelligence, taught me that true power isn't always loud or confrontational. Sometimes it's a silent, watchful intelligence, honed by years of listening, observing, and understanding the insidious shadows that lurk beneath the surface of charm. She kept that $15,000, calling it our emergency fund, a grim yet satisfying reminder of the price of vigilance. And her words, echoing my father's wisdom, still resonate. The best way to catch a predator is to let him think you're the prey. Marcus spent an entire year seeing us as vulnerable, defenseless, fragile. He staked his entire future on that assumption, and he lost everything. As I look back, I often wonder about the quiet battles fought every day, battles where the most unlikely heroes emerge from the shadows of expectation. Have you ever felt profoundly underestimated, only to reveal a hidden strength that surprised even yourself? Or perhaps, have you witnessed someone's calm exterior mask a profound inner power, a wisdom born from unexpected places? Share your thoughts and your own stories in the comments below. I'd love to read them. And if this story resonated with you, you might find solace or intrigue in another tale from my side of the story, perhaps the one where an ancient secret unearthed in a forgotten attic changed everything. You can find it right here. If you haven't already, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my side of the story. Your support allows me to continue sharing these intimate narratives, peeling back the layers of the ordinary to reveal the extraordinary that often lies just beneath the surface.